very, very rarely is domestic abuse a one-off incident. It's a pattern that creeps up and becomes normalised behaviour. And particularly if somebody has been subjected to controlling abusive behaviour for a very, very long time, it's likely to be extremely subtle. The perpetrator is likely to have honed their skills and been able to maintain control, often very, very invisibly to outsiders.
Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Dr. Shafer of Talks with Dr. Shafer. I'm so glad you're here. I'm a physician, mom, life coach, musician, author, publisher, and I'm passionate about helping others reclaim their stories so you can build your most beautiful future. Here on Talks with Dr. Shafer, we are passionate about bringing light to difficult topics that significantly affect our health and require our attention to create a safer and healthier future for us all. Domestic violence and abuse is scarcely discussed, difficult to address, and needs more attention and advocacy direly, especially for those who are experiencing it later in life and may not be getting as much attention in media, and this problem may go unaddressed. I'm so grateful to have Carrie Bauer on the show to share more about this important issue and how she is working to bring light to it and effect meaningful change for victims and their caregivers. Carrie Bauer is a registered social worker with Social Work England and an accredited trauma-informed trainer. As the host of Let's Get Visible, the podcast, and founder of Visible Later Lives, which specializes in raising awareness about domestic abuse and trauma in later life. Thank you so much, Carrie, for being here on the show.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Shafer.
Carrie, tell me what inspired you to, at this point in your career, as someone who has been advocating in the space of domestic abuse and violence for quite some time, to pivot your focus a bit to making people who are experiencing abuse later in life more visible and helping address this problem?
That's a really good question, and it's probably been something that I've been working on in the background for a number of years alongside other roles. It's been a passion that's bubbled away for a very, very long time. I could go back to childhood and where the real passion started, but I'll just emphasise where kind of things started to click into place for me, and that was in 2017. And I discovered in 2017 that our crime survey, so in England and Wales, we have something called the Crime Survey for England and Wales. And that's where data is collected on all sorts of crimes. And I discovered that domestic abuse, rape, and sexual assault, that data had an age limit. And the age limit was 59. And it was at that moment that I realised this is why we've not been talking about this topic. This is why people in later life are invisible. Because if we don't have data, we don't have research. We don't have research, we don't have funding. We don't really know the scale of the problem. So at that point, the Crime Survey for England and Wales were changing that age limit, but they still had an age limit, so they moved it to 74. And so in my role at the time, I was working for a national charity in the ageing sector in England. And I persuaded our kind of influencing team to have a report. So we published a report called No Age Limit, The Hidden Face of Domestic Abuse. And that's where that work really started to come together. The passion had been there for years. I'd worked in all sorts of different sectors, and I could see it, but I didn't really have the language or the evidence. And all of a sudden, this was evidence why people were so invisible. So we started that campaign, and eventually, obviously, we then had a global pandemic, which stalled quite a lot. We also, at the time, had the Domestic Abuse Act, which is a piece of legislation that was passed through Parliament at the time. So there were lots of delays to that work, and we had to be really, really, really gritty and persistent with our ask. But eventually we did get that age limit removed, but we only have 3 years worth of data in England and Wales. I don't know what the situation is globally, but still we have a massive problem with visibility of that particular age group. So
Wow.
that's really where the passion started to make sense to me. For many, many years, I was working with people and seeing domestic abuse through a lens that I didn't really have a language for.
Hmm. I think that's a really important way that you phrased that many of us, even people who have a passion for understanding and alleviating this problem, don't have the language for it.
Yeah.
It's not something that we've been trained to understand. And I wanted to point out an important tool that you have on your website. Can you talk about what inspired you to create that and why it's so important to, when we're having these conversations, start with making sure that we're all using the operating definition of the problem of the issue and making sure we're using an inclusive operating definition, because the traditional idea of what domestic violence is, for example, is not what we understand it to be now.
Are you talking about the animation that I have?
Yes, yeah,
Yeah. So
exactly.
that animation was developed by an organisation in Wales called Doist Choice, and it was
Mm.
developed with a group of older victim survivors of domestic abuse. And they do amazing work, and they gave me permission to have that adapted, which was great. What that animation explains in language that is more familiar to an older person. So things like even domestic violence, but domestic abuse, coercive control, intimate partner, family abuse, all of these terms often don't really mean anything. And if we go back, violence within an intimate relationship was often quite normalized, particularly in a heterosexual relationship. There was a lot of subservience. Women were expected to serve their husbands. They were expected to put their own needs behind their husbands, their children. So that sort of behaviour became quite normalised, certainly in the 50s and 60s. And it was only really sort of the equality movement in the 70s that started to lift the lid on that. But still, for that particular generation, there's still very much that recognition that we're talking about physical violence, and it needs to be a partner, usually of the opposite sex. It's often described as a man, often a white man and a white woman with young children. And that's kind of the imagery that we see when we look at campaigns, when we look at service provision. And so there's a phrase, isn't there? You can't be what you can't see. If you're not seeing yourself in campaigns and posters and awareness raising materials, you're going to think that can't be possibly be me. But also we live in a really ageist society. So there's often intersects with those feelings of not feeling worthy, that somebody else
Mm.
is more worthy of support. So that animation very gently introduces a range of behaviours from a range of people that we can be, and in the UK we call it personally connected. So we are talking about relationships beyond an intimate partner. That could be an adult child, a grandchild, a niece, a nephew, a cousin. It takes on board the complexities of the changing world and all the different relationships that we might have.
Exactly. And I think it's important to, when you're making the operating definition and you are laying out all of the ways that abuse occurs, that it can be, as you've mentioned, physical, it can be sexual, emotional, financial, or other ways to harm or control an individual. It's important that we understand this definition. And it's also really important that we understand the magnitude of the issue. So I wanted to share some statistics and highlight the underreporting of domestic violence for the
Yeah.
older population. So, data that we have here in the United States is around 4 million older Americans are victims of abuse each year. Statistic that I found: 76.1% of physical abuse against older adults is by a family member. So it's important, like you said, when we're looking at data, we don't know where the problem lies. We don't know what the problem lies if we don't have the data. So important to help us understand where the problem is, where are places that we can affect positive change to keep people safe. And I think also incredibly importantly, only 1 in 24 cases of abuse against older adults is reported. And that's where there's so much
Mm.
opportunity. And this is a shared experience with other victims of domestic violence of all ages, that reporting is very sparse compared to what people are experiencing. And how do we change that? How do we move the needle so that we get more accurate data and make sure that we are helping individuals the best that we can?
Well, conversations like this are a great start, but also bringing those conversations to the everyday. So, the media play a huge role, and we don't see older faces, older victim survivors, older victims of a domestic homicide, for instance. We don't see those stories. They're very, very rare, and often behaviour might be explained away. So I think really we're at the baseline here of making this everyday conversation, but also talking about the nuance. There is a lot of nuance. Very, very rarely is domestic abuse a one-off incident. It's a pattern that creeps up and becomes normalised behaviour. And I think we have this real mental health movement at the moment, and a much greater understanding around mental health and trauma, and weaving it into those conversations, because we know over here, so our stats are about 2.1 million people experience domestic abuse in our country, which is considerably smaller than the United States of America. So that's possibly, we're seeing more reporting, maybe percentage wise, because we have that broader definition, maybe. But also making those everyday conversations and linking that the impact of domestic abuse, if not supported appropriately, if not acknowledged, if not validated, can often lead not only to a diagnosis of a condition, which actually is usually a trauma response. Somebody doesn't feel heard, doesn't feel supported. What impact does that have on people as they grow older? We don't age out of that trauma without the support that we need. And so thinking about it, maybe sometimes raising awareness, we need to think about the cost implications. Think about a victim of domestic abuse in younger life and what the potential impact might be on their life trajectory from a health point of view, from an economic point of view. How is that going to impact somebody later in life? So almost not just focusing on somebody being abused in later life, but the impact of abuse in later life as well, and bringing these two conversations together. Because actually, I think when we really think about that, we're talking about vast numbers of people.
Absolutely. And how do you, when working with people and people reaching out to you, are there tools or suggestions you make to help people who are asking, how do I learn to identify this? Because as we discussed before we started taping this show today, I was sharing that my experience as a physician is that I did not receive any training. Now, this
No.
was, um, let's see, how many years ago? 15 years ago, give or take. I didn't receive any training in my schooling about how to identify elder abuse, how to identify, frankly, even domestic violence and coercive control. And it's really interesting because obviously it's a high stakes environment in the medical field. you are dealing not only with patients, but very often with their family systems, especially older in life or early in life. There's this, these two situations where it's very common to have a family member accompany. And early in life, that makes really great sense. And sometimes later in life, it makes sense if there are physical or potentially cognitive reasons why having someone be there as presumably an ally of this person as a support to this person is really helpful. But we don't necessarily have training in medicine, and I think in other fields as well, to help us raise the red flags when what's happening is not support, but it's actually a manifestation of coercive control, of trying to actually strip that person of their autonomy and control what they say, what they do, the medications they take, what they tell their physician about what's going on in their lives. So, are there ways that we can raise our awareness and look out for red flags so that we can be a part of the solution? And if we see those red flags, what are some safe ways to try to help and support the people that we are concerned about?
Okay, that's a big question. So I'll start with the first part of that question and kind of what to look out for.
Yeah.
Well, what to look out for is really, really unique to that individual. And particularly if somebody has been subjected to controlling, abusive behaviour for a very, very long time, it's likely to be extremely subtle. The perpetrator is likely to have honed their skills and been able to maintain control, often very, very invisibly to outsiders. So I would say to practitioners, really trust your instinct. If something doesn't feel right, go with that instinct. There are obvious indicators, such as if somebody has a variety of conditions which could be related to domestic abuse, and we can go through all sorts of conditions from confusion, memory loss, have they suffered a head injury? If we're thinking about the physical impact, non-fatal strangulation, we know there is a correlation between that and strokes, incontinence. So all of these, ask curious questions about the past. I'll talk to you about what those questions might be. It might be a feeling, it might be the presence of a adult child, adult family member, or an intimate partner, always needing to be there, never allowing the person maybe to answer questions. You might spot a look, body language. I worked with somebody who used to take his hearing aids out, and that was a sign to his wife that there was about to be a consequence when I left them. I didn't learn that until the end of her life, and she told me within days of dying. They're very, very subtle signs, and we will miss them because often this isn't new for many, many older people. So I would say a lot of the signs are already there, as they would be for anybody. Misuse of medication is also a really useful sign, and looking at side effects, asking people, what's normal for you. So some questions that you can ask a person if you do have that gut feeling. And there are tools out there where you can actually go through a toolkit of kind of what are the signs. But I do believe in gut feeling. A really useful question, which can often generate a conversation that feels quite safe if you're on your own with that person, is what does a typical day look like for you? What that can often draw out is whether there are routines, rituals, and rules. And Professor Jane Monckton-Smith, who is a criminologist here in the UK, is very well respected. She talks about the homicide timeline and control being a really significant risk factor. And she uses the 3 C's. She says the perpetrator's ultimate goal is entrapment using control. So if we think about control. Where might the control be? There might be specific routines, timekeeping, certain rituals that they have to abide by. Has that routine, has that control been challenged? So that's your second C. So what might challenge that control? And now that could be the person who is being harmed and abused. It could be that they choose to challenge. Either they don't know the rules, they might have memory issues and might have not been able to abide by the rules, but they might challenge them. They might actually feel confident and want to use their autonomy to say, no, I'm not making your dinner at 5 o'clock every night. They might choose to do something differently, and often that's stripped away later in life and very normalised. But if that challenge happens, equally that could be a professional asking questions. So we've got to be careful how we do that. It might be illness. Something that challenges that perpetrator's control will then lead to a consequence, and the consequence will be the abusive behaviour. Now, that might be visible to those of us outside. It might be a bruise, it might be a physical injury, but it might not be. It might be very, very subtle. And so asking what a typical day looks like, thinking about those 3 C's as you have that conversation, and you don't have to ask direct questions, but you can ask things like, okay, so you, for instance, get up at 7 o'clock every morning and you always put on an outfit that's been put out for you. That's a routine. That's control. What if you chose to wear something different? So the question could be really open again. What if you chose to wear trousers and not a skirt? That then gives that person that opportunity to think out loud that there might be a consequence to a routine and ritual without you actually asking that question directly. And it just opens up in a really soft and gentle way that opportunity to kind of say it out loud and possibly feel validated. And usually what happens is that person is processing your reaction and what they're saying out loud, possibly for the first time. A long
Absolutely.
answer to your question.
I appreciate the long answer because I think for many people, as we started this discussion off with, the theme that this is something we often don't talk about, we don't think about, we're not educated about. And I think, as you mentioned, these conversations are a great starting off place. And it's also very interesting because when we discuss, okay, we've identified some of the red flags, right? So for instance, myself as a physician, okay, I'm learning the red flags and I'm noticing them in clinic. Or you are out in the community and you're noticing red flags in people that you are getting to know and you have concerns. What are safe ways that you can show support or you can help direct them to support? Because as you mentioned, when you challenge an abuser, that can be quite a dangerous time. And I think it's important to understand as we're learning about things like abuse and coercive control, you're not being asked as a victim or as someone who's supporting the victim to confront an abuser, because the abuser is likely aware of the dynamic that's there, and they're trying to perpetuate that. And so that's not the goal. It's not to necessarily confront the abuser. The goal is to shift the attention and energy to supporting the victim. So do you have pointers on how to initiate that, or how to safely bring to light support systems in communities, online, etc.?
Well, it's about initially creating that safe space, isn't it, to have that the start of a conversation. I think we need to be really careful that we don't kind of put our hero cape on and think we have to kind of solve this person's problem. This person is likely to be an expert in their own situation. They might be aware of what's happening, they might not be. And your questions might be starting them off on that route to awareness. So it might be very, very early days. So I think creating that safe space of what would you like to happen next? What can I do? What do you need? Those sorts of questions they might not be able to answer, but they may well have thought about that question many, many times before, and they may have a ready-picked answer for you. They may know exactly what you want to do. So very much allowing them to lead that conversation is really important. This is a person that's possibly not had any power or autonomy for a very, very long time. So that will feel quite alien to them. So go easy. You might want to give them some helpline numbers. It depends what's appropriate. You might have a relationship with them where that you can invite them back to continue that conversation and then do a bit of research in between so that you're ready. There's a variety, and for somebody it depends on your kind of policies and procedures. For somebody that's at significant risk, you might need to go and seek some advice from a specialist service. And it's really important that if you are having to break confidentiality, that you share that with the person, but you share that in a measured way. So it varies, and I can't give you a step-by-step, this is what to do. It's very much about really empowering that person to go at their pace. And many older people will need a lot more time because there's a lot of unlearning that's needed there. The way I love a visual. The way I try and think about this is this older person is in the middle of a maze, and the maze might have exits, it might not have any exits. The hedges might be really high. There might be some ladders to help them get over the hedges, but there might not be. And their intersecting identities could make that maze much more complicated. So if you can try and visualize that, and your role is to help them navigate their way out of that maze. Now, that could just be helping them find their way through part of the maze, and then it might be another professional or a family member that helps them navigate the rest. It's very nuanced and complex, but we can sometimes do more damage than good if we rush in.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a really important thing that you are highlighting because, especially in caregiving roles, medicine, and things like that, the urge can be to put on that hero cape, and you were kind of trained to do that, and that can
Yeah,
be the wrong thing in the moment. But creating that supportive space, which again is not necessarily something that everyone in the healthcare sphere was actually trained to do. They were trained to solve problems.
yeah,
So they see an issue or a problem and they want to solve it. Learning how to create that space so people can come to you in their own time is really important. There's a quote on your website that you'd had, and it says, "Those who do not move do not notice their chains," by Rosa Luxemburg.
yes, yes. Yeah, many people and many professionals feel that way as well. So it's important, it's important to recognise there is a huge amount of discomfort. And as you said earlier, and I've reflected on my own practice, some of that learning is deeply uncomfortable because we possibly have colluded with a perpetrator or witnessed abusive relationships and not seen it. And that's really uncomfortable.
Yeah, it is. When I was preparing for our discussion today, I was thinking about a personal story that I wanted to share that I found really interesting. And I think that, telling these anecdotes is really important to bring home what's really happening in communities and what's happening in spaces where people are actively helpers, where people are deliberately spending their time, even in a volunteer sense, right? They're not getting paid to help others. And even they, in their good heartedness, end up perpetuating
Yeah,
abuse. And so the story I wanted to share about domestic abuse and domestic violence was I had been injured while skiing. And as was quite typical for me at that time, I was really trying to push through. I was with the coercive controller in my life. And I was really trying to push through, but the pain was quite intense. I couldn't hold my arm up, and I recognized, okay, I need to go to ski patrol. I'd never done that in my entire life. So that was, even seeking help when you're in that position is quite challenging and foreign. And so I went to ski patrol, and of course I refused the sled because that's what is pretty typical for a doctor as well as someone in the position I was in. And so we skied down all together, me, the my partner at the time, and the ski patroller skied down, had to take a gondola, and then had to go to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. And my partner didn't leave me until it was absolutely forced upon that person because of the COVID related policies in the facility at the time. And I will never forget. And I think, again, being mindful of our words and how we support people and what we say to people is so important. I learned that from this. And as a ski patroller now, it's something that I talk to fellow patrollers about, to be very careful with what you say to people when you're treating them. This man looked at me and said, wow, how amazing it is. Most partners, they get their partner to the ski patrol with their injury. They say, listen, you got your cell phone, it's fully charged. Great. I'm going to go enjoy my day, my $400 ski ticket. I'm glad you're safe. Let me know when you're ready and I'll pick you up. And they go. They abandon them. This person won't leave your side for a second. They really love you. You are so lucky. And they had no idea what I'd been through just the week before that incident, and that there was a really good reason why that person wouldn't leave me alone for a second, because this was the first time I was out of my bubble and would have the opportunity potentially to share what was going on in my world outside of what had just happened, just an accident. And it was a really impactful experience for me. And unfortunately, just as human beings on a psychological sense, it does often take an experience like that where it's personalized for you to really recognize the impact a particular way of being or speaking to someone else has. And that's why I think it's so important for conversations like these to share those anecdotes and share the data so that hopefully we can move the needle so it doesn't have to happen to you. It doesn't have to happen to your mother or your father or your sister or your friend, that you've heard these stories and you're a little more cognizant of those red flag behaviors and how you're showing up for people so that you don't inadvertently gaslight them or abuse them or act as a flying monkey in their world that
Yeah.
kind of keeps them in that space of, oh, maybe I am crazy. They are good. It's probably me.
Yeah. Yeah. And that word devotion is often used in respect of older people. It gets used very, very frequently. And thinking about your experience, that middle C, he had control, the middle C, the challenge, that was where that challenge was potentially going to challenge his control. And that's why he stayed with you, devoted, as people observed. And like you say, those messages reinforce probably what he's told you time and time again. I think about that in the context of a 40, 50, 60-year relationship, possibly the only intimate, if we're talking about intimate partners, the only intimate relationship you might have ever had. Generations of where that was so normalised. So expecting a generation to be aware of those nuances and subtleties is really, really challenging when you're in it.
Exactly. Can you share some stories or some experiences that you've had or other professionals have shared with you on your journey that helped put it into perspective for you and helped shape how you want to address this problem. Because again, I think that hearing these stories and really understanding the need is so important in shaping the support and shaping the way that we address the problem.
So I think really from my perspective, I'm quite unique in that a lot of people in that are talking about this topic have worked in the domestic abuse sector. And actually, my knowledge has come from working as a social worker in a hospital setting and working with people towards the end of their life. And I had a really privileged job that is quite rare now, where I work with people for a very long time. I built relationships with them, trusting relationships. And what I started to see time and time again was that people were waiting till the last days of their lives. Sometimes the perpetrator was alive, sometimes the perpetrator had died years before, but actually, sort of at end of life care, it was the time that they wanted to share their experiences and start to kind of make sense of it for themselves. And what I want is for that not to happen, for people to get to that end point earlier, whether that's in midlife so they don't enter later life in, you know, with that, or even if the abuse doesn't end, even if it remains until their last days, validation is very, very, very empowering. And actually having these conversations, people hearing these conversations, they might not seek support, they might not have the conversation themselves, but knowing that you're not the only one, knowing that you're not going mad is very, very empowering. So that would be one ask. That's at the base, the basics. What I would say is some of the conversations I've had, what I've done in my e-learning module is I've created 7 different stories. Now they are fictional stories, but they're based on lots of experience and lots of conversations and research in terms of the dynamics. So they're really useful stories to have a read through, or you can listen to them. I tell the story as well. One story that isn't in there, and it's a story that probably for me is the one where Grace, and she's not called Grace, I use Grace as a name. She said to me, "Your generation have choices I don't. Don't waste it." And I remember she told me that when I stopped wearing my wedding ring. So she knew that something was happening in my life. And I didn't share what that was, but she must have seen something in me that she recognised. And she had that conversation with me. And Grace was the lady whose husband always took out his hearing aids. And a bit of a trigger warning. At the end of life, those of us that worked with Grace and her husband, thought that they'd never had children. But they had children. They'd had one child, they'd had a boy. And he ended his life when he was 18. And Grace she had to destroy all of the photographs of this son. She was never allowed to mention his name. And there was clear control there all along, but I saw it as a traditional marriage, routines, rituals. I didn't know what was happening behind closed doors. I didn't know the consequences, and it was only at the end of life that she told me. And I won't share the graphic details of that, but she wanted to share with me that she was a mother, that she had a son, but she'd never been able to talk about him. They'd moved to a very isolated area, completely disconnected from anybody that would have known about the son. And Grace was 95 when she died. She'd lived probably 60 years of her life, bereaved by suicide, ashamed and unable to talk about that. And Grace said to me, I said, "What can I do for you, Grace? What do you want to happen?" And she said, "All I want to do is not have a bedtime. Just want to go to bed when I choose to." That was all she wanted. She always wanted to watch a drama at 9 o'clock at night. And so we were able to find a residential home that she could go into, and her husband was in a different room on a different floor. He couldn't get to her at night. And for the last few weeks of her life, she got her wish. And it was a really simple wish. And I often think I wish I could have done more for her, because I worked with her for about 3 years. And this was at the very end of that relationship. And so it's Grace that really kind of has set that fire alight. It was already there many, many years ago through personal experience as well. But Grace is the reason that I have to keep reminding myself, however much apathy there is out there, however much people don't want to listen, Grace told me not to waste the opportunity of being a generation behind her. And I'll never forget that.
That is so impactful. Thank you so much for sharing your experience with Grace. And it really highlights what you were sharing with us before about the life-changing importance of providing that support and being a safe space. You don't know what they need. As you said earlier, they're the expert in them. And that really applies to everything, what we want for our medical care, our life, our happiness, our health. And you making such a big impact in the final days of her life, just allowing her to watch a show late and allowing her to have, and I shouldn't say the word allowing her, isn't that an interesting choice of words? But to her, I'm kind of reflecting on what that was to her. Wow, you're allowing me to have
Yeah,
autonomy. You're allowing me. And the bigger picture, the zoom out is we want to get to a place where victims, and statistically speaking, most often women, are not feeling like really normal choices are something they need to be allowed to make.
absolutely. And the
Yeah.
more we lift the lid on this topic, the more we can prevent that happening. Because we know, think about it, ending a healthy relationship later in life is nearly impossible. It's really complicated. It's difficult. That maze, a separate maze, it's a huge maze. Finances are intertwined. We might be financially dependent on the person that we're with. Family dynamics, there might be children. It's so complicated. Add in years of domestic abuse. And so even if we can't meet the needs of older people, and I hope that we can, let's think about this in a preventative sense as well. If we reach people, and like you say, mainly women, men are affected, but it is a different dynamic, and I'm happy to talk about that on another episode or now. But mainly women are trapped in that maze. And what we want to try and do is help prevent them entering that maze in the first place.
Exactly. And prevention is where the best work that we can do for anything for our health and wellness. And I have to say, that is the inspiration for this show. Working with patients who have medical problems, serious ones, neurological conditions that bring someone in to see their neurologist. They're often quite serious, impactful, and often incurable problems and conditions that need to be managed and possibly effective, not necessarily treated to a cure.
Mm.
And so, as a neurologist, you're working with people often long term, like you had said in the hospital, and you are trying to find ways to positively affect their relationship with their condition and how they're able to live their lives so that they're living a happy, fulfilled, as healthy as possible life. And it just makes me think of how we can support someone. I, as a physician, am very limited in what I can do for a patient as far as treatments I can offer if they can't sleep at night because they're not safe,
Mm.
or if their body is flooded with adrenaline constantly, with stress hormones, because they are victims of abuse or violence. And so that's why I'm so passionate about creating spaces where we have these conversations, because the inspiration for me was, as a physician, understanding how many times I'd been there in the room and myself and the patient are just banging our heads against the wall trying to do right by them, get them healthier, get them in better control of their health and wellness journey, when we were kind of ignoring the elephant in the room that was taking up so much of the energy and oxygen. We could not effectively treat their seizures, their headaches, without addressing that elephant in the room. But even though it was taking up all the space and affecting their health, it was invisible. And so I love how you are working on making people more visible later in life, because of this sector where we are dealing with and trying to make more visible victims of abuse and violence. People later in lives are often some of the least seen. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. And I would absolutely love to have you back on the show to talk about more specifically victims who are male, because as you said, they have a different experience as well. And there may be different red flags. And I think also, a more extensive discussion on financial abuse is really important too, because a lot of people later in life experience that and want to know how to cope with that and how to create more resilience in their life so that they are less likely to become victims, even though they are at such risk. So I am so appreciative of you being here and sharing your wisdom and helping people learn how to at least start the conversation and be a support so people have that safe space. So thank you so much for doing that.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Oh, and Carrie, tell me how people can learn more about you, listen to your podcast, and connect with you for things like trainings and support.
So I'm very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I come up as Carrie Bauer, Visible Later Lives, and I've got orange on. I'm always wearing orange because I want this topic to be visible. So that's an intentional decision. You can listen to the podcast on Spotify. It's called Let's Get Visible, and that's green background with orange again. And then I do have a website, visiblelaterlives.limited, but I'm sure you'll be putting those on the show notes. And we do have a discount for the e-learning, which is really basic, uses storytelling, but that's a really low cost start entry point. And you can see kind of what style of training I deliver. And then if you're interested, I'm more than happy to come and speak to organisations, groups, just contact me. And you can contact me at visiblelaterlives@outlook.com.
Thank you so much for your advocacy and making this invisible problem, this often invisible problem, more visible and helping keep people in our community safe. We so appreciate you. And storytellers, thank you so much for being here. I hope that this episode was very informative for you and inspiring to help you make sure that you are both being preventive in the way that you are living your life, so that hopefully you won't fall prey to this sort of abuse later in life, but also thinking about how you can be a positive support to people in your life as well. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, stay safe and take care. I'll talk to you soon.